After nursing a lion back to health, a woman is touched when it returns to her years later. But the reason for its visit holds a surprise that will leave her in awe. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Texas sun beat down on Sarah's pickup truck as she drove along the dusty road, responding to an anonymous call about injured wildlife. As a veterinarian with 15 years of experience, she'd handled countless emergency situations, but something about this call felt different. The caller had mentioned gunshots and a large animal, leading her to bring extra medical supplies. When she arrived at the coordinates, tire tracks crisscrossed the ground, suggesting a recent disturbance. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and followed a trail of broken branches into the brush. The signs of poaching were everywhere: spent bullet casings, trampled vegetation, and most alarmingly, blood spots on the ground. 20 yards in, she found him. The male lion lay on his side, his golden mane matted with blood. His breathing was labored, and Sarah could see at least 2 wound sites from her position. Her training kicked in immediately as she assessed the situation. The lion was unconscious but alive, likely due to blood loss from what appeared to be gunshot wounds. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Even unconscious, an adult male lion posed significant risks. She pulled out her tranquilizer gun as a precaution and began her initial examination. The lion had 2 bullet wounds, one in his shoulder and another grazing his flank. Neither appeared immediately life-threatening, but infection and blood loss were serious concerns. As she worked to stabilize him, Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Lions weren't native to Texas. This had to be an escaped or illegally kept animal. The presence of poachers suggested the latter. She needed to act fast, but the legal complications were already forming in her mind. Back at her truck, Sarah made several rapid phone calls. Her clinic wasn't equipped for large predators, but she couldn't leave him here. Using her emergency network, she arranged for immediate transport and cleared space in her facility's largest treatment room. Throughout the process, her colleagues questioned her decision. "This isn't a house cat, Sarah," her assistant Mark warned over the phone. "We're not set up for this." The community's reaction was swift and largely negative. Within hours of transporting the lion to her clinic, Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with concerned citizens and local officials. Mayor Thompson himself called, expressing serious reservations about housing a dangerous predator within city limits. Her closest friend Alina stopped by the clinic, worry evident in her expression. "You're taking an enormous risk," Alina said, watching Sarah prep for emergency surgery. "What if he wakes up? What if he's aggressive? The liability alone could ruin you." Sarah continued her preparations, her movements precise and determined. "I took an oath to help animals in need," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I can't just leave him to die because it's inconvenient or risky." The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah extracted both bullets, repaired the damage, and administered antibiotics. Throughout the procedure, she documented everything meticulously, knowing she'd need to justify her actions to authorities later. As she worked, she noticed old scars on the lion's body, evidence of previous mistreatment. That evening, as Sarah monitored the lion's vital signs, she began making notes about his care requirements. She'd need special permits, proper containment facilities, and a long-term plan. The logical part of her mind screamed that she was in over her head, that she should call wildlife services and wash her hands of the situation. But as she watched his chest rise and fall, something deeper took hold. This wasn't just another patient. This magnificent creature represented everything she'd fought for in her career. The right of every animal to receive care, regardless of species or circumstance. She decided to call him Leo. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, checking his IV drip. Together. That night, Sarah slept on a cot next to Leo's enclosure, monitoring his condition. She knew the real challenges would begin tomorrow, but for now, she was certain of one thing. She'd made the right choice, regardless of what anyone else thought. The morning after Leo's surgery, Sarah faced her first bureaucratic hurdle. A representative from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department arrived unannounced, armed with a stack of paperwork and a stern expression. The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Sarah learned the full extent of regulations surrounding exotic animal care. You need permits for housing, transportation, and medical treatment, the representative explained, sliding form after form across Sarah's desk. Plus, there's the matter of establishing proper containment protocols, regular inspections, and proving adequate financial resources for long-term care. Sarah spent the next week navigating a maze of applications and requirements. Her clinic needed significant modifications to meet safety standards. The cost estimates made her stomach turn. Reinforced enclosures, security systems, and specialized medical equipment would cost well over $100,000. Her savings wouldn't cover a quarter of it. During a particularly frustrating phone call with her insurance company, Sarah watched Leo through the monitoring system. He was recovering well, showing signs of increased alertness. She couldn't give up now, but she needed help. Sarah organized a town hall meeting at the local community center to raise awareness and funds. She prepared a detailed presentation about Leo's situation and the broader issues of exotic animal trafficking. The turnout was decent, but the reception was cold. "Why should we spend our money on a dangerous predator?" demanded Tom Wilson, a local business owner. "Our schools need funding. Our roads need repairs. And you want us to build a luxury cage for a lion?" Others voiced similar concerns. Sarah tried to explain the importance of wildlife conservation and proper animal care, but she could see she wasn't reaching them. The meeting ended with only $320 in donations, barely enough to cover Leo's antibiotics for the week. Discouraged but determined, Sarah turned to social media. She created a fundraising page and shared Leo's story, complete with photos of his injuries and recovery progress. The response was mixed. While some people shared the page and made small donations, others left harsh comments questioning her judgment and priorities. The breakthrough came during a small fundraising event at a local coffee shop. Sarah was explaining Leo's situation to a sparse crowd when a man approached her. He introduced himself as David Chen, representing the Wildlife Protection Alliance. "We've been monitoring your situation," David said, handing her his card. "Your dedication to Leo's care, despite the obstacles, has impressed us. We'd like to help." The alliance offered more than just financial support. They provided legal expertise, helping Sarah navigate the permit process. They connected her with other veterinarians experienced in big cat care. Most importantly, they showed her how Leo's story could inspire broader change. "This isn't just about one lion," David explained during a strategy session. "It's about changing how people view wildlife conservation. Leo can be the face of that change in your community." With the Alliance's guidance, Sarah restructured her approach. Instead of simply asking for donations, she developed educational programs. She organized workshops about wildlife conservation, invited school groups to learn about veterinary medicine, and created volunteer opportunities at her clinic. The community's attitude began to shift. Local businesses, seeing the educational value, started sponsoring events. The mayor, who had initially opposed Leo's presence, attended a workshop and publicly praised Sarah's dedication to both animal welfare and community education. "I was wrong," he admitted during a local news interview. "Dr. Sarah hasn't just saved a lion. She's brought valuable learning opportunities to our town." However, not everyone was convinced. A vocal minority continued to oppose Leo's presence, arguing that resources should be spent elsewhere. Sarah received anonymous letters suggesting she should stick to treating pets and leave wild animals in the wild. During a particularly challenging day, when the permits were delayed again and a potential donor backed out, David pulled Sarah aside. "You're not just fighting for Leo anymore," he said. "You're fighting for every animal that needs someone to stand up for them. That's why they're pushing back so hard. Because change is uncomfortable. Sarah looked through the window at Leo's enclosure, where he was now strong enough to stand and move around. The sight of him recovering, despite everything, reinforced her resolve. She wasn't just saving one lion. She was setting a precedent for how communities could respond to wildlife in need. That evening, Sarah began drafting plans for what would become the Texas Wildlife Recovery Center. It was time to think bigger than just temporary housing for Leo. With the Alliance's support, she could create something lasting, a place where education, conservation, and community could come together. The permits would come. The funding would come. For now, she had work to do. 3 years passed since Leo's rescue. Sarah's clinic had evolved into a small but well-equipped wildlife sanctuary, with Leo's enclosure as its centerpiece. The morning routine became a dance they both knew well. Sarah arriving at sunrise, Leo's deep rumble of greeting echoing across the grounds. Through the security of reinforced fencing, Sarah observed the changes in her patient, permanent resident. Leo's wounds had healed completely, leaving only faint scars beneath his now full mane. He'd gained muscle mass, his frame filling out to a healthy 400 pounds. The fearful, injured creature from that first day had transformed into a confident, magnificent animal. "Morning, big guy," Sarah called out, checking the entry protocols on her clipboard. Each interaction required strict documentation, a requirement she'd learned to appreciate rather than resent. The regulations that once frustrated her now provided a framework for safety and consistency. Today marked a significant milestone. After months of preparation and countless meetings with wildlife authorities, Sarah had received permission to begin Leo's outdoor rehabilitation program. The sanctuary now included a 1-acre enclosed exercise area, complete with natural terrain and enrichment features. Sarah watched through binoculars as Leo explored the space for the first time. His movements were cautious at first, muscles tensing as he tested the earth beneath his paws. Then, something shifted. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught the sense of the open air. In that moment, Sarah saw something she hadn't realized was missing. The natural instincts of a wild animal awakening. Leo's pace quickened. He moved with increasing confidence, investigating every corner of the enclosure. When he encountered the artificial rock formation they'd installed, he scaled it with fluid grace, settling at the top to survey his domain. Sarah found herself holding her breath, struck by the sight of him silhouetted against the Texas sky. The observation team documented everything. Leo's physical capabilities exceeded their expectations. He could sprint at full speed, leap considerable distances, and demonstrate hunting behaviors when presented with appropriate enrichment activities. His strength and agility suggested complete recovery from his injuries. These developments sparked difficult conversations among the sanctuary staff. "He's thriving," Dr. Rodriguez, their consulting wildlife specialist, noted during a review meeting. "We need to consider if keeping him in captivity is still in his best interest." Sarah had been avoiding this question. The logical part of her mind understood that successful rehabilitation should lead to release. But the reality was complicated. Leo had no pride to return to, no territory to claim. His early experiences with humans, while unknown, had clearly been traumatic. Yet he'd adapted to sanctuary life, formed bonds with his caregivers, and showed no signs of stress in his current environment. During one of their morning sessions, Sarah sat near the enclosure, reviewing Leo's latest health reports. He approached the fence, closer than usual, and settled into a relaxed position parallel to where she sat. These quiet moments had become more frequent, a comfortable coexistence that spoke of trust earned over years. "What's best for you?" Sarah wondered aloud. Leo's ear twitched at her voice, but he remained settled, his breathing steady and calm. The question wasn't really for him. It was for herself, for the team, for everyone invested in his welfare. The sanctuary had grown around Leo. What started as an emergency medical intervention had evolved into a legitimate conservation and education center. School groups visited regularly, Learning about wildlife protection through Leo's story, research teams studied his rehabilitation process, contributing to the broader understanding of big cat care in captivity. Sarah documented these thoughts in her daily log, adding them to the years of observations she'd accumulated. Every day with Leo added to their knowledge, challenged their assumptions, and raised new questions about the relationship between humans and wildlife. That evening, as the sun set over the sanctuary, Sarah completed her final rounds. Leo had returned to his main enclosure, moving with the confident grace that still amazed her. He settled into his favorite spot, a raised platform that allowed him to observe the sanctuary grounds, while remaining partially concealed by artificial foliage. Looking at him, Sarah realized that perhaps the question of release wasn't the right one. Leo's journey hadn't ended with his physical recovery. It had evolved into something else. He'd become an ambassador, bridging the gap between the wild world he came from and the human world that had both harmed and healed him. "Maybe this is exactly where you're meant to be," Sarah said softly, making her final notes of the day. Leo's eyes met hers briefly, that same deep, inscrutable gaze that had captured her attention 3 years ago. In it, she saw neither a wild animal yearning for freedom nor a captive creature resigned to confinement, but a being who had found his own way of existing between those two worlds. As she locked up for the night, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their work together wasn't just about rehabilitation anymore. It was about understanding, adaptation, and finding new ways to protect and preserve wildlife in an increasingly complex world. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the official seal of the Texas State Development Commission. Sarah read it 3 times, her hands growing colder with each pass. A 500-acre development project had been approved for the land adjacent to the sanctuary, land that served as a crucial buffer zone between the facility and urban development. The project specifications detailed a massive mixed-use complex, shopping centers, luxury apartments, and an entertainment district. Construction would begin in 6 months, bringing heavy machinery, constant noise, and dramatic changes to the local ecosystem. The sanctuary's peaceful environment would be shattered. Sarah immediately called an emergency meeting with her staff and the Wildlife Protection Alliance representatives. They gathered in the conference room, the development plans spread across the table like a battle map. "This isn't just about noise pollution," Dr. Rodriguez explained, pointing to the environmental impact projections. "The construction will disrupt local wildlife patterns, affect groundwater systems, and create light pollution that will impact all our residents, especially Leo." David Chen from the Alliance studied the legal documents. They followed all the required procedures. The environmental impact study appears superficial, but it meets minimum legal requirements. Fighting this through traditional channels will be difficult. Sarah stared through the window at Leo's enclosure. He was resting in the shade, unaware that his hard-won peace was under threat. The sanctuary had become more than just a rehabilitation center. It was a symbol of coexistence between urban development and wildlife conservation. This project threatened to destroy that balance. The next week became a blur of activity. Sarah organized meetings with city officials, but was met with rehearsed responses about economic growth and job creation. The development company, Vista Properties, sent representatives armed with glossy presentations and promises of eco-friendly design elements that felt hollow against the reality of what they planned to destroy. "We understand your concerns," their spokesman said during a particularly frustrating meeting, "but progress is inevitable. We're prepared to install sound barriers and maintain a modest green buffer zone." Sarah's response was direct. A sound barrier won't protect against months of construction vibration. It won't preserve the delicate ecosystem we've worked to maintain. "You're not offering solutions, you're offering bandits." The local media initially showed little interest in the story. Development projects were common news, and the impact on a wildlife sanctuary didn't seem newsworthy until Sarah changed the narrative. She organized a public demonstration that brought together an unlikely coalition: environmental activists, local families who visited the sanctuary, scientists studying Leo's rehabilitation, and even former skeptics who'd come to appreciate the sanctuary's value to the community. The protest wasn't large by city standards, about 300 people, but it was impossible to ignore. Participants carried signs featuring Leo's image and statistics about wildlife habitat loss. Children who had attended the sanctuary's education programs spoke about what they'd learned. Former critics of the sanctuary, including Mayor Thompson, stood alongside Sarah Vim. "When I first opposed this sanctuary, I was wrong," the mayor admitted to reporters. "It's become an invaluable part of our community. This development threatens not just the animals, but our city's character." Vista Properties responded with a PR campaign of their own, emphasizing job creation and economic benefits. They hired experts to dispute the sanctuary's environmental concerns, and suggested that Sarah was exaggerating the impact on the animals. The tension escalated when construction crews arrived to conduct preliminary surveys. Their presence alone disturbed the sanctuary's residents. Leo became notably agitated, pacing his enclosure and vocalizing more frequently. Sarah documented every change in behavior, building a case for the real-world impact of even minimal disruption. Local news finally picked up the story when they realized it wasn't just about environmental conservation, it was about community identity. The sanctuary had become a source of pride for the city, attracting researchers and tourists. The conflict represented a larger debate about development versus preservation. Sarah received calls from larger media outlets, but she remained focused on local action. She organized educational tours for city council members, showing them firsthand what was at stake. She compiled data on the sanctuary's economic impact, tourism revenue, research grants, educational programs, proving that preservation could be as valuable as development. "We're not against progress," she explained during a community forum. "We're against the destruction of something irreplaceable. Once this habitat is gone, we can't get it back." The pressure began to show results. City council members started asking harder questions about the development plans. The environmental impact study was challenged, revealing concerning oversights, but Vista Properties remained unmoved, protected by permits and contracts already in place. As the 6-month deadline approached, Sarah felt the weight of time pressing down. Each morning, watching Leo patrol his territory, she wondered how much longer his peace would last. The sanctuary had survived numerous challenges, but this felt different. A threat not to their existence, but to their ability to fulfill their mission. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Sarah sat near Leo's enclosure. He approached the fence, his presence as commanding as ever. In his eyes, she saw what she'd been fighting for, not just a single animal or facility, but the principle that progress shouldn't come at the cost of destruction. The battle was far from over, but something had shifted. The community that once questioned Leo's presence now rallied to protect it. The sanctuary had become a line in the sand, a place where people chose to take a stand against unchecked development. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more protests, more battles. But tonight, watching Leo patrol his territory under the Texas stars, Sarah knew they wouldn't face them alone. The community center auditorium was packed beyond capacity for the emergency town hall meeting. Sarah stood at the podium, facing hundreds of faces, some familiar, others strangers, drawn by the growing controversy. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs of the sanctuary and its residents, with Leo's story featured prominently. "This isn't just about saving a wildlife sanctuary," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's about understanding our role in the ecosystem we share." She clicked through slides showing the sanctuary's progression over the years, from a modest rehabilitation facility to a recognized center for conservation and education. The data was compelling. Over 5,000 students had participated in their educational programs last year alone. Research conducted at the sanctuary had contributed to 3 published studies on wildlife rehabilitation. The facility had become a model for urban wildlife conservation, attracting visitors and researchers from across the country. As Sarah explained the impact of the proposed development, a commotion near the back of the room caught everyone's attention. David Chen was leading a small group through the crowd, rolling a large screen. When they set it up, the live feed from Leo's enclosure appeared. The timing was perfect. Leo had just emerged for his evening patrol. The audience fell silent, watching the massive lion move with fluid grace across his territory. Even through the screen, his presence was commanding. "This is Leo," Sarah continued, her voice softer but carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Many of you know his story. He came to us barely alive, a victim of illegal wildlife trafficking. Today, he's not just surviving, he's helping us understand how humans and wildlife can coexist." The feed showed Leo investigating an enrichment puzzle recently placed in his enclosure. His methodical approach demonstrated both intelligence and adaptability. Several children in the audience gasped when he successfully extracted his reward, displaying problem-solving skills that challenged common perceptions about wild animals. "The development project won't just affect Leo," Sarah explained. "It threatens the delicate balance we've created. The noise, pollution, and habitat disruption will impact every animal in our care, and the local wildlife that depends on this area for survival." Dr. Rodriguez took the stage next, presenting detailed environmental impact data that Vista Properties had overlooked or minimized. The sanctuary's location served as a crucial wildlife corridor, connecting several natural habitats. The development would effectively sever these connections, creating isolated pockets of wilderness that couldn't sustain healthy wildlife populations. The audience's response shifted from polite attention to genuine concern. As the full scope of the threat became clear, when Sarah opened the floor for questions, dozens of hands shot up. "What about relocating the sanctuary?" someone asked. Sarah had anticipated this question. "Relocation isn't just logistically challenging, it's potentially dangerous for our residents. Many of our animals, including Leo, have established territories. Moving them would cause severe stress and could undo years of rehabilitation work." The discussion continued, but something unexpected happened when a local business owner stood up. "I've been thinking," he said. "The sanctuary brings people to our city. My restaurant sees more customers when there are events or programs here. Maybe we should be expanding the sanctuary, not shrinking it." Others shared similar observations. The sanctuary had become an economic asset, drawing eco-tourists and researchers who supported local businesses. The proposed development promised future economic benefits, but the sanctuary was already delivering them. As the meeting progressed, Sarah noticed a shift in the room's energy. People weren't just listening, they were engaging, offering suggestions, and forming connections. A local teacher described how the sanctuary's programs had transformed her students' understanding of science. A real estate agent questioned whether the development would actually increase property values more than the existing sanctuary. The live feed continued to show Leo, now resting on his favorite elevated platform. His calm presence seemed to underscore every point being made. This wasn't about choosing between progress and preservation, but about finding a way to achieve both. Near the meeting's end, Mayor Thompson requested to speak. "When this sanctuary was first proposed, I was among its strongest opponents," he admitted. "I was wrong. What Dr. Sarah and her team have built here isn't just a facility. It's a testament to what our community can achieve when we choose conservation over destruction." The meeting concluded with the formation of an action committee, combining environmental experts, business leaders, and community representatives. Their goal: develop alternative proposals that would allow for economic growth while preserving the sanctuary and its surrounding habitat. As people filed out, many stopped to watch Leo on the screen. He had moved to the edge of his enclosure, facing the sunset. The image captured everything they were fighting for: the dignity of wildlife, the importance of preservation, and the possibility of coexistence. Sarah stayed behind, reviewing notes and speaking with committee volunteers. The real work was just beginning, but something fundamental had changed. The sanctuary was no longer fighting alone. It had become the community's cause. Looking at Leo's image on the screen, Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope. They had transformed one injured lion's story into a movement. Now they needed to ensure that story had a proper ending. The sanctuary's annual awareness event transformed into something much larger than previous years. Local businesses donated tents and equipment, creating a festival-like atmosphere across the grounds. Educational booths lined the main paths, while a stage had been set up near Leo's enclosure, close enough for visibility, but maintaining a safe distance for both animals and visitors. Sarah stood backstage, reviewing her notes one final time. Through the gaps in the curtain, she could see hundreds of people settling into their seats. Local media crews set up cameras, and a live-stream team prepared to broadcast the event across social media platforms. The stakes had never been higher. 5 minutes, David whispered, handing her a bottle of water. The online viewer count is already past 10,000. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. She'd told Leo's story countless times, but today needed to be different. Today wasn't just about one lion or one sanctuary. It was about changing how people viewed the relationship between urban development and wildlife conservation. As she took the stage, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds. The crowd fell silent, and Sarah began, not with statistics or pleas, but with the story of that first day, finding Leo bleeding in the brush, making the decision that would change both their lives. "When I found him," she said, gesturing to the large screen showing Leo's rescue photos, "I had two choices: follow protocol and call in authorities who might arrive too late, or take a risk that seemed impossible at the time. Many of you thought I was crazy. Some of you still might." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Sarah continued, moving through the years of rehabilitation, the challenges they'd overcome, and the community that had grown round their work. As she spoke, live footage of Leo appeared on the screen. He was alert, watching the gathering from his elevated platform with characteristic intensity. "Leo isn't just a success story," Sarah explained. "He's proof that we can find better ways to coexist with wildlife. The development threatening our sanctuary isn't just about buildings and profits. It's about choosing what kind of community we want to be." The presentation shifted to show the sanctuary's impact: successful rehabilitations, groundbreaking research, educational programs that had inspired a new generation of conservationists. Sarah introduced several students who had completed internships at the facility, each sharing how their experiences had shaped their career choices. As the event progressed, Sarah noticed a figure at the back of the crowd: Marcus Sterling, CEO of Vista Properties. His presence was unexpected, his expression unreadable as he observed the proceedings. Their eyes met briefly before he turned to whisper something to his assistant. Sarah continued, but her mind raced. Sterling's reputation preceded him. He'd developed properties across 3 states, earning both praise for economic growth and criticism for environmental impact. His presence at the event could mean anything from genuine interest to strategic reconnaissance. The event reached its emotional peak when Sarah shared their vision for the future: an expanded sanctuary that would serve as a model for urban wildlife conservation, combining research facilities, educational spaces, and protected habitats. The architectural renderings, donated by a local firm, showed how the sanctuary could grow while preserving crucial wildlife corridors. "We have an opportunity," Sarah concluded, "to show the world that progress doesn't require destruction, that we can build our future while protecting our natural heritage." The applause was thunderous, but Sarah's attention was drawn to movement near Leo's enclosure. The great lion had descended from his platform and moved closer to the fence, his presence commanding attention even from a distance. The cameras swung to capture him, and the crowd fell silent again, awed by his timing. After the presentation, as attendees moved through the educational booths, Sarah received word that Marcus Sterling wanted to meet. They convened in her office, away from the crowds and cameras. Impressive presentation, Dr. Sarah Sterling began, declining the offered seat. You've built quite a following. This isn't about following, Sarah replied. It's about doing what's right for our community and our environment. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. Community sentiment is important, of course, but so is progress. Your sanctuary is sitting on prime real estate, and your current operation barely utilizes its potential. We utilize it exactly as it should be utilized, Sarah countered, as a bridge between urban development and wildlife conservation. Bridges can be rebuilt elsewhere, Sterling said smoothly. I'm prepared to offer funding for a new facility, better equipped and larger than this one. Everyone wins. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm office. Sterling hadn't come to understand. He'd come to negotiate what he saw as inevitable. His presence at the event wasn't about appreciation. It was about sizing up his opposition. This isn't a real estate issue, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said firmly. You can't just transplant years of established habitat and expect the same results. Our location, the ecosystem we've protected and enhanced, the community we've built, these things can't be replaced with a bigger budget and newer facilities. Sterling's expression hardened slightly. I admire your dedication, Doctor, but you should understand, this development will happen. The only question is whether you'll benefit from it or stand in its way. As he left, Sarah realized the true nature of the battle ahead. It wasn't just about permits and protests anymore. It was about fundamentally opposing views of progress and preservation. Sterling saw the sanctuary as an obstacle to be removed. She saw it as a model to be protected and replicated. Through her office window, she could see Leo lounging in the late afternoon sun, unaware of the forces gathering against his home. The sanctuary had faced challenges before, but this felt different. Sterling wasn't just a developer. He was a symbol of the relentless pressure to prioritize profit over preservation. The success of today's event suddenly felt smaller against the weight of what lay ahead. But as Sarah watched the remaining visitors engaging with the educational displays, sharing their experiences, and forming connections, she understood that they'd built something stronger than just a sanctuary. They'd built a community dedicated to proving that there was a better way forward. The Vista Properties headquarters occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the city below. Sarah sat in the reception area, a folder of alternative development proposals on her lap, waiting for her appointment with Marcus Sterling. After their confrontation at the sanctuary event, she'd spent weeks preparing for this meeting. Sterling's assistant finally ushered her into his office, a space that seemed designed to intimidate with its massive desk and floor-to-ceiling windows. Sterling himself stood looking out over the city, his back turned to her until the door clicked shut. Dr. Sarah, he said, turning with a practiced smile, I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I have, Sarah replied, opening her folder, and I've developed some alternative proposals that could benefit both the sanctuary and your development goals. She laid out the plans on his desk, detailed schematics, showing how the development could be modified to preserve crucial wildlife corridors, while still achieving significant real estate value. The sanctuary's research team had worked with environmental engineers to ensure the proposals were both practical and profitable. Sterling barely glanced at them. These modifications would reduce our buildable area by 30%. The profit margins wouldn't justify the investment. The sanctuary brings in tourism revenue, research grants, and educational funding, Sarah countered. Working with us could enhance your project's value. Green development is increasingly attractive to buyers, Dr. Sarah Sterling interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. Let me be clear, this isn't a negotiation. The development will proceed as planned. Your sanctuary can either accept our relocation offer or face the consequences of progress. Consequences. Sarah kept her voice steady, despite her rising anger. Are you threatening us, Mr. Sterling? Not at all. I'm simply stating facts. Development is inevitable. Fighting it only hurts your cause in the long run. As Sarah drove back to the sanctuary, her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Sterling's dismissal of their proposals wasn't just frustrating. It revealed the depths of his disregard for environmental concerns. This wasn't about profit margins. It was about power. The sanctuary was quiet when she arrived. Most of the staff having left for the day, Sarah walked to Leo's enclosure, needing to clear her head. The big cat approached the fence, sensing her distress. His presence, as always, helped center her thoughts. Her phone buzzed. A message from David Chen. Turn on the local news. Sarah rushed to her office and pulled up the evening news stream on her computer. The lead story made her blood run cold. Sterling had announced an expansion of the development project, now including plans for a state-of-the-art wildlife education center that would replace outdated facilities. He was trying to undermine them by presenting himself as the more capable steward of wildlife education. The strategy was clever. Instead of fighting the sanctuary directly, he was positioning his development as its natural successor. As Sarah processed this new threat, her phone rang again. This time it was Mike Harrison, a former journalism student who'd done a story on Leo years ago. He now worked for an environmental news website. Sarah, I've been digging into Sterling's previous projects, Mike said, without preamble. There's something you need to see. Can I come by tomorrow morning? What kind of something? The kind that needs to be discussed in person. And Sarah, don't talk to any media until we meet. That night, Sarah stayed late at the sanctuary, reviewing their options. The permits were approved. The city council was swayed by promises of economic growth, and public opinion could be turned against them by Sterling's new strategy. It seemed like every path forward was blocked. Around midnight, her phone lit up with a text from Alina, her oldest friend and a local environmental lawyer. Just saw the news. Don't give up. Remember why you started this. Sarah walked back to Leo's enclosure. He was resting but alert, his eyes reflecting the security lights. Looking at him, she remembered that first day, the injured lion in the brush, the decision to take a stand, regardless of the obstacles. She began drafting an email to the sanctuary's support network. If Sterling wanted to play the public opinion game, they needed to be ready. The sanctuary had something he could never replicate: years of proven impact, real relationships with the community, and most importantly, authenticity in their mission. By dawn, Sarah had outlined a new strategy. They couldn't match Sterling's resources or political connections, but they had something more valuable: truth. Every animal they'd rehabilitated, every student they'd inspired, every piece of research they'd contributed, it all told a story of genuine commitment to wildlife conservation. Mike arrived early, carrying a thick folder and looking like he hadn't slept. You're not going to believe what I found, he said, spreading documents across Sarah's desk. Sterling's wildlife education centers in other states, their glorified petting zoos, and the environmental impact studies for his previous developments. Let's just say there's a pattern of convenient oversights. As they pored over the documents, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Sterling's facade was polished, but underneath lay a history of environmental negligence. The question was how to expose it without turning the situation into a mere political battle. We need to be careful, Sarah said, studying a particularly damning report. This isn't about attacking Sterling. It's about protecting what we've built here. Mike nodded, understanding. The story isn't Sterling's failures. It's your success. His past just proves why your work needs to be protected. Sarah began making notes, a plan forming in her mind. They had the truth on their side. Now they needed to make it impossible to ignore. The online petition reached 50,000 signatures within the first week, but Sarah knew they were racing against time. Construction equipment had already begun arriving at the development site, lined up like yellow-painted soldiers along the sanctuary's border. Each morning brought new machines, their presence a constant reminder of the approaching deadline. Mike's investigation had provided crucial ammunition. Working with environmental journalists and legal experts, they'd begun publishing a series of detailed reports examining Sterling's past projects. The stories weren't sensational, but carefully documented. Case studies showing the long-term environmental impact of his developments. The pressure's getting to him, David reported during their morning meeting. Sterling's PR team has been working overtime to counter our reports. They're proposing additional green spaces in the development plan. Sarah was about to respond when one of the sanctuary's veterinary technicians burst into the office. "Dr. Sarah, you need to come to Leo's enclosure now." The urgency in his voice had Sarah running before he finished speaking. As she approached Leo's area, she heard it, a sound she'd never expected to hear at the sanctuary. A cub's cry. Leo was pacing along the fence line, his attention focused on a point just beyond the sanctuary's boundary. There, trapped in the undergrowth, was a lion cub no more than 3 months old. Its tan fur was dirty and matted, suggesting it had been on its own for some time. "Call Dr. Rodriguez," Sarah ordered, already moving toward the emergency protocols cabinet, "and get me the rescue kit." The next hour was a carefully orchestrated rescue operation. The cub was weak, but still had enough energy to make capture challenging. What complicated matters further was Leo's intense interest in the situation. He kept pace with their movements, watching every attempt to reach the cub. When they finally managed to secure the young lion, initial examination revealed dehydration and minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The bigger mystery was how it got there. Lion cubs don't just appear in Texas wilderness. Likely another trafficking victim, Dr. Rodriguez concluded after a thorough examination. Based on his age and condition, I'd guess he escaped or was abandoned by whoever was transporting him. As they treated the cub in the medical facility, Sarah noticed something extraordinary through the monitoring system. Leo had positioned himself as close to the medical building as his enclosure allowed, his attention completely focused on the building where they were treating the cub. "I've never seen him this engaged," David observed, watching the footage. "It's almost like he knows." Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. The arrival of this cub wasn't just a rescue opportunity. It was a powerful symbol of why their work mattered. 2 generations of trafficked lions, connected by circumstance and saved by the sanctuary's existence. The media response was immediate and intense. Local news crews arrived within hours of the rescue, and national outlets picked up the story by evening. The image of the tiny cub, juxtaposed with footage of Leo watching over the medical facility, captured public imagination in a way their previous campaigns hadn't. Sterling's team tried to spin the situation to their advantage, releasing a statement about how their proposed wildlife education center could better handle such emergencies. But their timing backfired. The sanctuary's proven track record of successful rescues and rehabilitation stood in stark contrast to Sterling's theoretical proposals. "The cub's stable," Dr. Rodriguez reported late that night. "He's responding well to treatment. The real question is what happens next." Sarah stood watching through the observation window as the small lion slept under careful monitoring. "We need to document everything," she said. "Every treatment, every milestone in his recovery. This isn't just about saving one cub anymore." The sanctuary's social media channels began sharing regular updates on the cub's progress. They named him Hope, suggested by one of their young volunteers, and quickly embraced by their growing online community. Each post about Hope's recovery drew more attention to the sanctuary's work and, by extension, to what would be lost if the development proceeded as planned. Leo's behavior continued to fascinate the staff. He remained unusually attentive to the medical building, and his vocalizations increased whenever Hope was visible through the windows. Dr. Rodriguez suggested it might be instinctual recognition of a cub in distress. But Sarah sensed something deeper. It's like history repeating itself, she told Alina during a late-night call. Leo was brought here by circumstances beyond his control, just like Hope. Now their stories are intertwined with the sanctuary's future. The parallel wasn't lost on their supporters. The sanctuary had already proved itself essential once by saving Leo. Now it was proving itself again with Hope. The development threat took on new urgency. It wasn't just about preserving existing work, but protecting the sanctuary's ability to respond to future emergencies. Sarah spent that night updating their presentation materials to include Hope's story. The Cubs' arrival had given them something Sterling couldn't counter with promises or plans. A living, breathing example of why the sanctuary needed to remain exactly where it was. As she worked, she could hear Leo's occasional calls in the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she allowed herself to focus on what they'd achieved. 2 lives saved, 2 stories intertwined, and one more powerful reason to keep fighting. "We're not done yet," she whispered, watching Hope sleep peacefully on the medical center's monitors. Not by a long shot. The conference room at National Geographic's regional office buzzed with anticipation. Sarah sat beside David, watching the production team set up their presentation. The documentary proposal they'd submitted about Leo and Hope had caught the attention of senior producers, leading to this emergency meeting. "We don't usually fast-track projects like this," the lead producer, Amanda Torres, explained. "But the timing is crucial. Your sanctuary's situation represents a larger conflict playing out across the country. Development versus conservation." The proposal outlined a 3-part documentary series: Leo's rescue and rehabilitation, Hope's arrival and recovery, and the sanctuary's fight for survival. What made the pitch compelling wasn't just the animals' stories, but how they highlighted the broader implications of urban expansion on wildlife conservation. "We can begin filming next week," Amanda continued. "Our team believes this story needs to be told while it's unfolding, not after the fact." As they discussed logistics, Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her assistant. Marcus Sterling was at the sanctuary, demanding to speak with her. She excused herself from the meeting, instructing David to handle the documentary details. During the drive back, Sarah's mind raced. Sterling's unexpected visit, especially without his usual entourage of lawyers and PR people, suggested something had changed. The question was whether it would help or hurt their cause. She found him standing near Leo's enclosure, watching the great lion with an expression she couldn't quite read. Hope had been moved to a smaller enclosure within Leo's line of sight, and the older lion spent most of his time observing the cub's recovery. "Remarkable animals," Sterling said as she approached, not turning to face her. "I've been following the news coverage. Your little rescue operation has gone viral." "It's not an operation," Sarah replied evenly. "It's who we are and what we do. Every day, not just when cameras are watching." Sterling finally turned to look at her. His usual polished facade showed cracks, slight shadows under his eyes, his ties slightly askew. "The board of Vista Properties has concerns about the negative publicity. Your story about Hope has complicated things. The truth often does that. Let's be direct, Dr. Sarah. What will it take to end this? Name your price. A new facility, better funding, whatever you want. Just not here. This location is too valuable." To a loud roar from Leo cut him off. The lion had moved closer to the fence, his attention fixed on Sterling. Though Sarah knew it was likely coincidental timing, the interruption felt significant. "That's the fundamental difference between us, Mr. Sterling," Sarah said quietly. "You see value in terms of dollars and development. We see it in lives saved, research conducted, and communities educated. You can't buy that or relocate it." Sterling's expression hardened. "I tried to be reasonable, but you should know, my team has been investigating your permits, your funding sources, every detail of your operation. One mistake, one violation, and is that why you're really here?" Sarah interrupted. because our investigation into your past projects has revealed some interesting patterns. Those wildlife education centers that never materialized, the environmental impact studies that somehow missed critical data. For the first time, she saw genuine surprise flash across Sterling's face. Before he could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed again. A message from Mike. National news picking up Hope's story. Major networks want interviews. Call ASAP. Sterling saw the shift in her expression. This isn't over, he said, straightening his tie. You're fighting against inevitable progress. No, Mr. Sterling, we're fighting for a better definition of progress. After he left, Sarah called an emergency staff meeting. The documentary deal, the national media attention, and Sterling's visit had changed the dynamics of their struggle. They needed to be prepared. He's scared, David observed during the meeting. The public narrative is shifting. His usual tactics aren't working. Dr. Rodriguez added, Hope's recovery is proceeding faster than expected. His bond with Leo, even from a distance, seems to be aiding his rehabilitation. It's unprecedented. We should document everything for the documentary. The team worked late into the night, preparing for the increased media attention. They organized their research, compiled documentation of Sterling's past projects, and developed a clear message. The sanctuary wasn't just fighting for its own survival, but for a new model of conservation that could be replicated nationwide. Sarah's last task of the day was checking on Hope. The cub had grown stronger, his personality emerging as he recovered. Through the observation window, she watched him play with enrichment toys, his movements becoming more confident each day. Leo's enclosure was visible from her position, and she could see him in his usual spot, watching over Hope's area. The connection between the two lions had become a powerful symbol of the sanctuary's mission, proof that rehabilitation wasn't just about physical recovery, but about creating connections that transcended circumstance. As she made her final notes, Sarah realized they'd entered a new phase of the battle. Sterling's visit hadn't been about negotiation. It had been about fear. Fear of losing control of the narrative. Fear of his past catching up with him. Fear of changing public opinion. We don't need to match his resources, she told David as they locked up for the night. We just need to keep telling the truth. Hope's story, Leo's story, our story. They're all part of something bigger than one development project. The sanctuary was quiet, except for the occasional sounds from the animals. Tomorrow would bring camera crews, interviews, and more battles. But tonight, watching Leo maintain his vigilant guard over Hope, Sarah felt more certain than ever that they were on the right path. The community center was packed beyond capacity for the emergency city council meeting. Sarah sat in the front row beside David, watching Sterling's team set up their final presentation. The past week had been a whirlwind of media coverage, with Hope's story reaching international audiences and the documentary crew capturing every development. Sterling approached the podium, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. The confident swagger he'd displayed in every previous encounter was notably absent. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and then did something that made the entire room fall silent. He went off script. Before I begin the planned presentation, he said, his voice carrying a weight Sarah had never heard before, I need to share something personal. Yesterday, I visited the sanctuary again, this time without cameras or lawyers. I watched Leo and Hope, really watched them, and I remembered something I'd buried long ago. The council members leaned forward, equally surprised by this departure from the expected proceedings. Sterling continued, his voice growing stronger. When I was 10, my grandfather took me to Africa. We visited a conservation project, and I saw my first lion in the wild. That moment changed me, or it should have. Instead, I spent 30 years prioritizing profit over preservation, convincing myself that progress required sacrifice. Sarah felt David grip her arm in disbelief. Sterling reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn photograph. This is me, standing beside that lion's sanctuary fence. I found it last night, after spending hours watching your live stream of Hope's recovery. And I realized something. I've been fighting the wrong battle. He turned to face Sarah directly. Doctor, Sarah, your sanctuary isn't an obstacle to progress. It is progress. The kind I forgot was possible. The room erupted in murmurs as Sterling gestured to his team. They began distributing new documents to the council members. Completely revised development plans. Vista Properties would like to withdraw our original proposal, Sterling announced. In its place, we are proposing a partnership with the sanctuary. Instead of destroying habitat, we'll create the nation's first integrated urban wildlife conservation center, with the existing sanctuary as its heart. The new plans showed a dramatically different vision. The development scaled back and redesigned to preserve crucial wildlife corridors, with the sanctuary expanded to include state-of-the-art research facilities, educational centers, and protected habitat zones. Sterling's company would provide funding and resources, but operational control would remain with Sarah and her team. This isn't charity, Sterling clarified, addressing the stunned council. It's smart business. The sanctuary's success has proven that conservation and education can generate sustainable revenue. By partnering with them, we're not just preserving their work, we're creating a model that can be replicated across the country. Sarah stood, her heart pounding. Mr. Sterling, are you saying? I'm saying I was wrong, he replied simply. And I'm offering to help make things right. Not just here, but everywhere we operate. Your sanctuary showed me what's possible when we choose to build around nature instead of over it. The council chamber erupted in applause. Mayor Thompson called for an immediate vote on the new proposal. It passed unanimously. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation platform of the newly expanded sanctuary, watching Leo and Hope in their enhanced enclosure. The young lion had grown remarkably, his rehabilitation progressing faster than anyone expected. Leo had been a constant presence in his recovery, their unique bond becoming the subject of scientific study. The documentary was set to premiere next month, telling not just their story, but the larger tale of how one sanctuary changed the conversation about urban development and wildlife conservation. Sterling had become an unlikely ally, using his influence to promote similar projects across the country. Ready for the tour? David asked, joining her on the platform. A group of international conservation experts had arrived to study their model, hoping to replicate it in their own countries. Almost, Sarah replied, watching Leo guide Hope through one of their enrichment exercises. The younger lion had grown confident under Leo's watchful eye, developing strength and skills that would serve him well in the future. The sanctuary had transformed, but its heart remained the same. The new facilities enhanced their work without overshadowing their mission. Research teams studied the unique bond between Leo and Hope, adding to our understanding of lion sociology. Students from around the world came to learn about conservation, carrying these lessons back to their own communities. Sterling kept his word, becoming a leading voice for conservation-conscious development. The Texas model, as it became known, was being adopted by cities across the globe, proving that progress and preservation could coexist. As Sarah prepared to meet the visiting experts, she paused for one last look at Leo and Hope. Their story had started with a single choice: to help an injured lion despite the odds. That choice had rippled outward, changing not just their lives, but the very way we think about wildlife in an urban world. The sanctuary stood as proof that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of compassion. And somewhere in Africa, a worn photograph of a young boy beside a lion sanctuary found a new home, reminding future generations that it's never too late to remember what really matters.